It was one of those mornings that felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Cold, quiet, and gray, the kind of December dawn that makes you pull your coat tighter and wish you'd stayed in bed 5 more minutes. The air hung heavy with fog near the SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California, wrapping the massive buildings in a soft, misty blanket. Inside, engineers were already buzzing, coffee in hand, eyes glued to screens showing lines of code, rocket schematics, and countdown timers ticking down to the next big test. But outside, near the back edge of the property where the pavement gave way to patches of wild grass and tangled shrubs, everything was still. Elon Musk had just wrapped up another marathon work session, 18 hours straight. His eyes were tired, his shoulders stiff, but his mind was still racing, thinking about fuel mixtures, heat shield tolerances, and whether the next Starship launch would finally stick the landing. He wasn't supposed to be out here. He should have been in a meeting or maybe catching a few hours of sleep in his office. But sometimes when his brain was too full, the only thing that helped was walking, just moving one foot in front of the other, letting the rhythm of steps quiet the noise inside his head. So he stepped out alone, ignoring the protests of his security detail who hovered nearby in a black SUV. No entourage, no assistants, just him, his thoughts, and the crunch of gravel under his boots. He walked past loading docks, past rows of parked Teslas, past the quiet hum of generators until he reached the far corner of the lot where nature had started to creep back in. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete. Birds nested in the rafters of an old storage shed. And there, tucked beneath a thicket of frost-dusted bushes, something moved. At first he thought it was a stray dog or maybe a raccoon. But then he heard it, a sound so faint, so fragile, it almost vanished in the wind. A tiny broken mule, like a whisper of pain. He stopped, turned, squinted into the shadows. There, curled into a shivering ball, was a small wild cat. Not a house cat. This one had tufted ears, a short bobtail, and fur the color of dry sand and shadow. A bobcat kitten. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its ribs showed through its thin coat. One eye was swollen shut, crusted with dried fluid. The other blinked slowly, glassy with exhaustion. It didn't try to run. It didn't hiss. It just lay there, barely breathing, as if it had already given up. Most people might have walked away, called animal control, and kept going. But Musk didn't. He crouched down slowly, careful not to startle it. Up close he could see how cold it was, its fur damp from dew, its paws raw from the frozen ground. This wasn't just lost. It was dying. Without thinking, he shrugged off his jacket, a dark, lightweight Tesla-branded coat he'd thrown on hours ago. He folded it gently like he was handling something precious and reached toward the kitten. It flinched just slightly but didn't pull away. Maybe it didn't have the strength. Maybe it sensed he wasn't a threat. He scooped it up with both hands, cradling it against his chest like it was made of glass. The little body was alarmingly light, like holding a handful of feathers. But it was warm. Barely, and when he held it close, he felt the faintest thrum of a heartbeat. "Hey," he murmured, voice softer than anyone who'd seen him on stage or in interviews would have expected. "You're okay now." His security team saw it all from a distance. Later, one of them would say it was the first time they'd ever seen him move so slowly, so carefully, as if the whole future of space travel depended on not jostling that tiny creature in his arms. He carried the kitten back to the SUV, ignoring the surprised looks from his team. "Call the best wildlife vet in the area," he said, climbing in and holding the bundle close. "Not a regular vet. A wildlife specialist now." The driver hesitated. "Sir, we have the board call in 30 minutes. Cancel it," Musk said, not looking up. "This is more important." And just like that, the man known for building electric cars, launching rockets into orbit, and reshaping the internet dropped everything for a half-dead wildcat no one else had even noticed. The drive to the clinic was tense. The kitten didn't make a sound. It just lay there, eyes closed, breathing shallow and fast. Musk kept one hand on it the whole time, as if his touch alone could keep it anchored to this world. He didn't check his phone, didn't glance at emails, didn't think about satellites or stock prices or public opinion. For those 20 minutes, there was only this, a life slipping away in his hands and the quiet, desperate hope that it wasn't too late. When they pulled up to the Malibu Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, a modest building tucked behind eucalyptus trees, He was out of the car before it fully stopped. Staff rushed out when they saw who it was, but Musk didn't care about fame or protocol. "He's freezing," he said, voice tight. "He hasn't eaten. One eye's infected. I don't know how long he's been out there." The lead vet, a woman with kind eyes and decades of experience with injured wildlife, took the kitten gently. She didn't gawk or ask for a selfie. She just nodded, already assessing. "We'll do everything we can," she said simply. Musk stood there in his t-shirt, arms empty now, suddenly feeling the cold he'd forgotten in his urgency. He watched as they carried the kitten inside, wrapped in his jacket like a promise. He didn't leave. He sat in the waiting room, just a folding chair and a coffee table with old magazines, while the team worked. His phone buzzed constantly, alerts, messages, urgent requests. He silenced it. For once, the world could wait. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning fog. Inside, the vet cleaned the kitten's wounds, warmed him with heating pads, and started fluids through a tiny IV. His body temperature was dangerously low. His blood sugar even lower. They didn't know if he'd make it through the night. When the vet finally came out, she looked tired but calm. "He's stable for now," she said, "but it's going to be a long road. Bobcats this young don't usually survive alone in the city. Something must have happened to his mother." Musk nodded. "What are his chances?" She hesitated. "Honestly? 20%. Maybe less." He didn't flinch. Just looked down at his hands, then back at her. "Do whatever it takes. I'll cover all costs." She studied him for a moment, not as a billionaire, not as a headline, but as a person who'd just carried a dying animal through the cold because he couldn't walk away. "You care about him," she said, not as a question. "I couldn't leave him there," he replied simply. That night, after finally returning to his office, he didn't sleep. He sent a message to his assistant. "Find out everything about Bobcat rehabilitation. Get me daily updates," and set up a private line to the clinic. No one expected this. Not from him. The man who talked about colonizing Mars, who argued with regulators on Twitter, who seemed to run on caffeine and sheer willpower, was now quietly, fiercely invested in the fate of a wild kitten found behind a warehouse. But maybe that's the thing about real life. It doesn't follow scripts. Heroes aren't always in capes. Sometimes they're just people who stop walking when they hear a whisper of pain in the bushes and choose to listen. And so, in a quiet clinic by the sea, under soft lights and careful hands, a tiny bobcat fought to stay alive. And miles away, in a glass-walled office overlooking a city that never sleeps, a man known for thinking decades ahead found himself hoping, really hoping, for just one more sunrise for a creature most would have overlooked. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about optics. It was about seeing something broken and deciding, without fanfare, to try and fix it. That morning, the world kept spinning. Rockets were prepped, markets opened, news cycles churned. But in that small corner of California, something quieter happened. Something human, and sometimes that's where the most extraordinary stories begin. The days that followed were a blur of worry, waiting, and small, fragile hopes. The bobcat kitten, still unnamed, still fighting, lay in a quiet recovery room at the wildlife clinic, wrapped in soft blankets, connected to tiny tubes that dripped life-saving fluids into his tiny body. His breathing was shallow but steady, and though his eyes remained mostly closed, the vet team noticed something encouraging. His paws would sometimes twitch, as if dreaming of running through tall grass or chasing shadows in the wild. Back at his office, the man who'd found him couldn't stop thinking about those paws. He'd seen them, raw, cracked, covered in dried mud. He'd held them in his own hands. And now every time his phone buzzed with an update from the clinic, he'd pause whatever he was doing, whether it was reviewing launch trajectories or answering investor emails, and read it like it was the most important message he'd ever received. At first, the updates weren't good. On the second night, the kitten spiked a fever. His infected eye swelled worse, and he stopped responding to gentle stimulation. The vet called late, voice low and serious. "He's crashing," she said. "We're doing everything, but you should prepare yourself." Those words hit harder than he expected. He didn't cry. He wasn't the type. But he sat alone in his dimly lit office for a long time after that call, staring out at the city lights below, wondering why this one small life mattered so much. Maybe it was because it felt like a test. If he could save a company, a rocket, a vision for the future, why couldn't he save this? Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just that no one should have to die alone in the cold. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he called in a favor, not from a CEO or a senator, but from a veterinarian who specialized in exotic and endangered species, someone who'd once consulted on a conservation project in Africa. By dawn, that expert was on a flight to California, paid for in full, no questions asked. When she arrived, she didn't waste time. She examined the kitten, reviewed his blood work, and suggested a new antibiotic regimen, plus a special nutrient gel that could be fed through a tiny syringe. His body's been through trauma, she explained. But he's got fight in him. We just need to give him a reason to keep fighting. That became the new mission. From then on, the man started visiting the clinic almost every evening. Not during the day, too many eyes, too many cameras, but after midnight when the world was quiet and the only sounds were the hum of medical equipment and the distant crash of ocean waves. He'd slip in through the back entrance, hoodie pulled low, hands in his pockets, and sit in the observation chair just outside the recovery room. He never touched the kitten at first. The staff said it was too risky. Stress could set him back. So he just watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, watched the way his ears would flick at the sound of a bird outside, watched as little by little his good eye began to open more often, scanning the room with cautious curiosity. One night, during his usual visit, the vet tech on duty quietly said, "You know, most people wouldn't come back after the first day, especially someone with your schedule." He shrugged. He's got nowhere else to go. "But you do," she said gently. "And you keep choosing to come here." He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Maybe I needed this too." It was true. The past few months had been brutal. Public criticism, sleepless nights, decisions that affected thousands of people. He'd started to feel like a machine, input, output, repeat. But sitting here, watching this tiny wild thing cling to life reminded him that not everything had to be calculated or optimized. Some things just needed care, patience, presence. Then came the turning point. On the 7th night, as he sat in his usual chair, the kitten lifted his head, just slightly. His good eye locked onto the man through the glass. And for the first time he made a sound, not a cry of pain, but a low, rumbling purr. It was faint, almost inaudible, but the staff heard it too. They exchanged glances. Bobcats don't purr like house cats. It's rare, almost unheard of in stressed or injured individuals. He's calming down, the lead vet whispered, stunned. "He recognizes you." The man felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was tight. From that night on, the visits became more than just observation. With the vet's permission, he started sitting inside the room on a stool a few feet away, speaking in a low, steady voice. He didn't talk about rockets or AI or Mars. He talked about simple things, the smell of rain, the way stars look outside Austin, how his kids laugh when they see squirrels in the yard. He read aloud from engineering manuals sometimes, not because the kitten understood, but because the rhythm of his voice seemed to soothe him. And slowly, miraculously, the kitten began to heal. His fever broke. His eye cleared enough to open halfway. He started lapping at the nutrient gel, then soft meat paste, then tiny pieces of raw chicken. He gained weight, just ounces at first, then more. His fur grew back thicker, softer, the wild pattern of spots and stripes returning like a map of where he belonged. The staff began calling him Rocket, a name whispered by one of the man's children during a rare daytime visit. It stuck. Not because it was flashy, but because it captured something about him. The spark, the speed, the will to rise even when gravity pulled him down. Still, there were setbacks. One afternoon, Rocket panicked during a routine checkup, thrashing and biting in fear. It took 3 people to calm him, and afterward he refused to eat for nearly a day. The man arrived that night to find him curled in the far corner of his enclosure, eyes wide with fear, ears flat. He didn't try to approach. Just sat on the floor back against the wall and waited. For an hour, 2, he didn't speak, didn't move much. Just breathed slowly, steadily, like he was teaching the air how to be calm. Eventually, Rocket's ears twitched. He turned his head, took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he was sitting just a few feet away, watching, listening. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, soft toy, a stuffed mouse donated by a local shelter. He placed it gently on the floor between them and pushed it forward with his foot. Rocket sniffed it, pounced, batted it around like any young cat would. And for the first time he looked playful, alive. That night the man stayed until sunrise. Word began to spread quietly among the clinic staff. Not on social media, no photos, no leaks, but in hushed conversations over coffee. You won't believe who's been coming in at night. He sits with that bobcat like it's his own. He canceled a board meeting to be here when Rocket took his first real steps. None of it felt performative. There were no cameras, no press releases, just a man showing up again and again for something no one was watching, and that, perhaps, was the most surprising part, because the world saw him as larger than life, a disruptor, a genius, a lightning rod for controversy. But here, in this quiet room with the ocean breeze drifting through the vents, he was just human, tired, hopeful, trying. One evening, as he watched Rocket stretch and yawn, showing off sharp little teeth and powerful hind legs that were finally strong again, the lead vet sat beside him. "You know," she said, "most people think saving wildlife is about releasing them back into nature. And it is. But sometimes before that they just need to feel safe, seen, worth saving." He nodded. "I get that. Do you?" she asked gently. "Because I think you needed to feel that too." He didn't answer, but the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly said enough. As the weeks passed, Rocket grew stronger. He climbed the branches in his enclosure, leapt onto perches, batted at feathers tied to strings. His wild instincts returned, alert, curious, fierce. But whenever the man walked in, he'd pause, look over, and that low, rare purr would start again, like a secret only they shared. The bond wasn't about ownership. It never could be. Bobcats aren't pets. They're wild souls, meant for forests and canyons, not living rooms. But for a little while, in the space between survival and thriving, they met each other halfway, and in that space something shifted, not just for Rocket, but for the man who'd found him shivering in the cold. He started sleeping better, smiling more around his kids. Even his emails sounded lighter, still driven, still intense, but with a softness underneath like steel wrapped in velvet. No one knew how the story would end. Would Rocket ever be released? Could he survive on his own after all this time in care? Those were questions for another day. For now, there was just this: a warm room, a healing animal, and a quiet promise kept, one night, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. As the weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to take root. Not just in the recovery room at the wildlife clinic, but in the rhythm of everyday life. The bobcat, now strong enough to leap from perch to perch and bat at dangling toys with sharp, playful swipes, had become more than a patient. He'd become a quiet constant in a world that rarely slowed down. And the man who'd found him? He'd changed too. It wasn't dramatic. No grand speeches or sudden personality overhauls. But people close to him started noticing little things. He'd pause mid-sentence during a high-stakes call if a notification came through from the clinic. He'd cancel late-night strategy sessions to make his usual midnight visit. Once, during a rare family dinner, his youngest child asked, "Is Rocket going to come live with us?" And instead of brushing it off with a joke or a distracted "we'll see," he looked thoughtful and said, "He's not ours to keep, but he'll always have a place." That answer surprised even him, because somewhere along the way he'd stopped thinking of Rocket as a project or a rescue. He'd started seeing him as a person, not human, of course, but a being with his own will, his own story, his own quiet dignity. The bond between them deepened in ways no one could have predicted. Bobcats are solitary by nature, wary of humans, quick to bolt at the slightest threat. Yet Rocket would sit near the glass wall of his enclosure whenever the man arrived, tail flicking lazily, ears perked forward. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He watched, waited. And when the man spoke, softly, like he was sharing a secret, the bobcat would blink slowly, as if saying, "I hear you." Staff at the clinic began leaving the door open during visits. Not all the way, safety first, but enough that the man could sit just inside the room, cross-legged on the floor, while Rocket explored nearby. Sometimes the bobcat would pad over and sit a few feet away, close enough that the man could see the fine pattern of his fur, the way his whiskers twitched when he listened, Once, during a particularly rough week, when headlines were harsh and the weight of everything felt crushing, Rocket did something no one had ever seen before. He walked right up, pressed his head gently against the man's knee and let out that low, rumbling purr. He posted it late at night, not expecting much. Maybe a few thousand views, a handful of comments. But within minutes, the internet lit up. People weren't ready for this. Not from him. They'd seen the bold headlines, the fiery debates, the relentless drive. But this? This was tender. Human. Real. The video spread like wildfire, first to animal lovers, then to environmental groups, then to everyday people scrolling before bed who stopped, watched, and felt something stir in their chest. Comments poured in. I cried. This gave me hope. Never thought I'd see this side of him. Even critics softened. One wrote, okay, I still disagree with half the things he does but this is good. By morning, the video had over 5 million views. By the next day, 10 million. News outlets picked it up, not with their usual skeptical tone, but with genuine warmth. Tech titan's secret act of kindness goes viral. From Silicon Valley to the wild, a bobcat's second chance. Teachers showed the clip in classrooms. Wildlife rehab centers reported a surge in calls from people wanting to volunteer or donate. One shelter in Arizona said their adoption rates for native wildlife doubled in a week. But the most surprising ripple came from the man himself. He didn't capitalize on it. Didn't launch a merchandise line or turn it into a marketing campaign. In fact, when asked in an interview about the video's success, he simply said, Rocket didn't do it for attention. Neither did I. Still, the impact was undeniable. Inspired by the sanctuary footage, a group of engineers at SpaceX quietly started a side project, designing low-impact wildlife corridors near future launch sites, using drone mapping and AI to track animal movement and avoid disruption. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't make headlines. But it mattered. Then came the donations. Without any announcement, a $10 million gift appeared in the accounts of 3 major urban wildlife conservation nonprofits. No press release, just a note, for the ones no one sees. Staff at the organizations were stunned. They'd been struggling with funding cuts, stretched thin by growing needs. This wasn't just helpful, it was transformative. One director, fighting back tears during a team call, said, "This changes everything. We can expand our rescue network, hire more vets, protect more habitats, all because someone chose to care about one little cat." And that was the heart of it. It wasn't really about Rocket. Not entirely. It was about what Rocket represented. The idea that every life has value, even when it's broken, even when it's inconvenient, even when no one's watching. The man didn't give interviews about the donations. Didn't take credit. But those close to him noticed he seemed lighter. Like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been set down. One afternoon, while walking the perimeter of the Texas sanctuary during a rare visit, he stopped at the edge of a clearing. A motion sensor camera had captured Rocket just that morning, sitting on a sun-warmed rock, tail curled around his paws, gazing out over his domain like a king surveying his kingdom. The image was printed and tucked into the man's notebook. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind in the grass, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of something small moving through the brush. He didn't see Rocket that day, and he didn't need to because he knew the bobcat was thriving. Not as a pet, not as a symbol, but as himself, wild, free, whole. Later, back at his desk, he received a message from the lead vet at the clinic. It read, "You gave him a chance, but I think he gave you something too." He stared at the words for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes and nodded just once to no one but himself. The world kept spinning. Rockets launched. Markets rose and fell. Debates raged online, but in quiet corners across the country, people were doing small, kind things, checking on stray animals, planting native gardens, donating to local shelters, because they'd seen what one act of compassion could do. And it all started with a man who stopped walking when he heard a whisper in the bushes. No fanfare, no agenda, just a choice. That's the thing about real change. It rarely arrives with trumpets and banners. It slips in quietly, through a shared glance, a rescued life, a video posted late at night, and plants a seed. And sometimes, that seed grows into something no one expected: hope. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, of turning moments into memories and memories into meaning. A year after Rocket vanished into the Texas grass, the world had moved on to new headlines, new debates, new distractions. But for the man who'd once carried a half-dead bobcat through the cold, life had settled into a different kind of rhythm, one that still held ambition, still chased the stars, but now also made room for quiet things. Rocket's refuge had grown. What started as a 50-acre sanctuary for one wild cat had quietly expanded to over 200 acres. Now home to injured hawks, orphaned fox kits, and even a family of desert tortoises relocated from a nearby construction site. The land wasn't just protected, it was thriving. Native plants returned. Water sources attracted deer, javelinas, even the occasional mountain lion passing through. Hidden cameras captured it all. Life unfolding, undisturbed, exactly as it should be. He visited often, not as a spectacle but as a guest. He'd arrive in an unmarked truck, park at the edge of the property, and walk the trails alone, boots crunching on dry earth, eyes scanning the horizon not for problems to solve, but for signs of peace. Sometimes he'd spot Rocket. Not every time. The bobcat was elusive, as wild things should be. But when he did appear, perched on a ridge at dusk, or slipping through mesquite trees at dawn, it felt like a gift, not a guarantee. Once, during a rare family trip to the sanctuary, his youngest child pointed to a distant figure moving through the brush. "Is that him?" they whispered. He nodded. They stood together in silence, watching as Rocket paused, lifted his head, and seemed to look right back at them before vanishing into the golden light. No one spoke on the drive home. They didn't need to. Back at work, the change wasn't loud, but it was real. SpaceX began including wildlife impact assessments in every new site plan. Tesla factories installed bird-safe glass and created green buffers around their campuses. These weren't grand announcements. They were just choices, small, consistent decisions that added up. People who worked with him noticed he listened more, asked more questions, took longer pauses before answering. "He's still driven," one engineer said during a team dinner. "But it's like he's remembering there's more to life than speed." And maybe that was the true legacy of that cold December morning. Not the viral video, not the donations, not even the sanctuary itself, but the quiet shift inside a man who'd spent years racing toward the future, only to realize that some of the most important things happen right here, right now, if you're willing to stop and see them. One spring afternoon, he sat on a weathered bench near the sanctuary's observation deck, sipping coffee from a plain ceramic mug. The air smelled of rain and creosote bush. In the distance, a roadrunner darted across a dry creek bed. He wasn't thinking about satellites or stock prices. He was just present. A wildlife biologist from a local university approached, clipboard in hand. She'd been studying animal movement patterns on the refuge and wanted to share her findings. As she talked about how native species were returning, how the ecosystem was healing, he listened intently, asking thoughtful questions not as a billionaire, but as someone who genuinely cared. When she finished, she hesitated, then said, "You know, most people with your resources would have built a monument or named a building after themselves. But you built this?" And stepped back. He smiled faintly. "It's not mine." "It never was. It's theirs," she nodded, understanding. "Still, you gave it a chance." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the first stars blinked awake, he walked back to his truck. He passed the spot where Rocket's crate had been opened a year ago. The grass had grown back thick and green. No trace remained except in memory. He didn't post about the visit. Didn't tweet. Didn't need to. Some things are too precious for public consumption. Back home, his office looked the same, screens glowing, models of rockets on shelves, whiteboards covered in equations. But now, tucked beside his desk was a small wooden frame. Inside wasn't a photo of a launch or a product reveal. It was a still from the sanctuary camera. Rocket mid-leap, muscles coiled, eyes bright, utterly free. He glanced at it often. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Because in the end, this story was never really about saving a bobcat. It was about being saved by one. Saved from the belief that everything must be measured, optimized, monetized. Saved from the loneliness of thinking you have to do it all alone. Saved by the simple, radical act of caring for something that couldn't give anything back, except trust. And that trust? It changed everything. Today, Rocket still roams the refuge. Older now, wiser, his coat thick and his movement sure. He's been seen teaching his own kittens how to stalk prey, how to read the wind, how to live wild and well. The cameras catch glimpses, never too close, never intrusive, just enough to know he's thriving. As for the man, he still dreams of Mars, still pushes boundaries, still stirs controversy. But those who know him best say there's a softness beneath the steel now, a quiet strength that comes not from never falling, but from knowing how to help someone else rise. Sometimes, during late-night walks around his property, he'll stop and listen, to the owls calling in the trees, to the rustle of something small moving through the dark. And in those moments he feels it, the deep, unshakable truth that we are all connected. Human, animal, earth, sky. That saving one life might not change the world, but it can change the person who does it. And maybe that's enough. Because real change doesn't always come from grand gestures or billion-dollar plans. Sometimes it starts with a single choice to stop walking, to kneel down, to wrap a shivering creature in your jacket and say, "You're okay now." No one saw it happen that morning behind the SpaceX building. No cameras rolled. No crowd cheered. But that small act of kindness sent ripples far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Touching shelters, inspiring kids, shifting policies, healing land. And in the quiet heart of Texas, a bobcat runs free not because he was tamed, but because he was seen. That's the thing about true compassion. It doesn't ask for credit. It doesn't need an audience. It simply gives, and in giving receives something deeper, purpose. So the story ends not with a finish line, but with a continuation. Rockets still launch. Stars still call. But now there's also this, a patch of wild earth protected, a life restored, a man who remembers to look down, not just up. And in a world that often feels fractured and loud, that might be the most revolutionary thing of all. Because sometimes, the smallest spark, the quietest act of care, is the one that lights the way forward. Not with fire, but with warmth. Not with noise, but with presence. And in the end, that's how we all go from dying to thriving, not by doing everything, but by showing up for what matters, one small, brave choice at a time. One evening, she received an email from an unexpected source, a junior staffer on the congressional committee that led the investigation. Attached was a single document, a draft of proposed legislation inspired by the whole mess. It was called the Public Infrastructure Accountability Act. It wouldn't ban private companies from working with the government, but it would require clear boundaries, public oversight, and strict limits on data retention during emergencies. Most importantly, it would make it illegal to use that data for public disclosure without congressional approval. It wasn't perfect. It would take years to pass if it passed at all. But it existed. And that mattered. She printed it out, pinned it to her wall, and made herself a cup of tea. Outside, spring had arrived. Trees bloomed. Kids played in the street. Life, ordinary and resilient, kept going. Meanwhile, Musk shifted focus. He stopped posting about government secrets and started talking about decentralized identity, AI-driven governance, and neural democracy. He launched a new project under his X platform, a pilot program in a small town where residents could vote on local issues through an app, with decisions enforced by smart contracts. Critics called it a gimmick. Supporters called it the future. But most people just watched, wary but curious. What no one noticed at first was how the language had changed. It wasn't about tearing down the old system anymore. It was about building something new alongside it, something that looked like democracy but ran on code instead of constitutions. And because it was voluntary, it couldn't be regulated. Because it was innovative, it couldn't be questioned. Because it promised speed and simplicity, it attracted the very people democracy had failed. The frustrated, the ignored, the left behind. The reporter saw it coming. She wrote one last piece, not angry, not fearful, but clear-eyed. "The danger isn't that someone will destroy democracy," she wrote. "It's that we'll abandon it piece by piece, trading it for convenience, for clarity, for the illusion of control, until one day, we wake up and realize we've handed our future to a system that doesn't need our votes, only our attention." The article didn't go viral, but it was read by the right people, teachers, librarians, local officials, parents. People who still believed in messy, slow, human-centered systems. People who knew that real freedom isn't found in flawless algorithms, but in the right to be wrong, to argue, to change your mind, and to be heard, even when you're not trending. A year after the leak first surfaced, A small group gathered in a community center in the Midwest. They weren't politicians or billionaires. They were neighbors, teachers, nurses, small business owners, who'd grown tired of feeling like spectators in their own society. They launched a local news cooperative, funded by subscriptions run by volunteers with a simple rule. No anonymous sources, no algorithmic feeds, no outrage headlines. Just facts, context, and space for conversation. It didn't change the world, but it changed their town. And that, in the end, was how real change always began. Not with a bang, but with a choice. A choice to care, to question, to show up. Back in Washington, the Public Infrastructure Accountability Act gained its first co-sponsors. In Silicon Valley, engineers quietly left Musk's companies to join open-source projects focused on ethical tech. In classrooms across the country, students debated not just what was true, but how we know what's true and who gets to decide. The story of Obama's arrest became a footnote in history, books a cautionary tale about how easily truth can be bent when power shifts from public hands to private ones. But the lesson stuck. Technology isn't good or evil. It's a mirror, and what it reflects depends on who's holding it. One rainy afternoon, the reporter sat on her porch watching the drops hit the pavement. Her phone buzzed, a message from an old source. Just 2 words, it worked, she smiled. Not because the fight was over, she knew it never would be, but because people were finally paying attention. Not to the spectacle, but to the system behind it. Not to the loudest voice, but to the quiet ones building something better, brick by brick. She closed her eyes, listened to the rain, and thought about the future. It wouldn't be perfect. It would still be messy, frustrating, full of mistakes. But as long as ordinary people refused to let truth become a product and democracy become a relic, there was hope. And sometimes hope was enough. The rain slowed. A bird sang from a nearby tree. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. The world kept turning, not because of billionaires or former presidents, but because of people who showed up, spoke up, and refused to look away. That was the real story. Not the leak, not the conspiracy, not the power plays, but the quiet daily act of choosing to believe in something better and building it together, one honest word at a time.